Hello everybody, good morning, and thank you for coming to my talk about creating custom structural directives. So, what are structural directives? The star marks a structural directive, and like my friends Manfred and Vitali pointed out to me yesterday, structural directives are magical like the stars. So, we have star notation followed by the structural directive attribute name equal to a string, and this string has a microsyntax which basically has variable declarations and property binding, the way that we communicate from the directive class and the ng template. So we don't see an ng template here, but because the star gives us syntactic sugar, we have, if we have, for example, an structured directive like app carousel, which would just, move you to the next view or the previous view, we would have something like this. App carousel equals let book from books, autoplay on, delay, and we give the time, and let controls, and we implement, and we give what the actual markup will be inside that div. But desugared, the app carousel will look something like on the right, with the div being wrapped inside a ng template. This is what Angular does behind the scenes. It wraps the div in the ng template, places the directive attribute name on the ng template, and figures out the variable declarations and the data binding. So with the concise syntax that we have from the microsyntax, from becomes app carousel from, and we use a property binding with the square brackets and assign it to an expression. So this is the template expression now. And so this is the syntactic sugar that the star syntax gives us. So in order to create our own custom directives, we need to look at a few building blocks. ng template and TemplateRef, ViewContainers and ViewContainerRef. And this is what we will cover. And then we will have a look at how to create structural directives and have a look, if we have time, at the microsyntax a bit closer. First of all, ng template and TemplateRef. An Angular component is composed, an Angular application is composed of components. The component view is defined in the component template, but within the Angular gives us this really super cool HTML tag called ng template, which lets us define a view within the component view. And the view defined inside the ng template is called embedded views. The embedded view is not rendered when the component is first rendered. It is rendered only once it has been created, and we can create many instances of the embedded view. The ng template only works in this way, like a template inside a component template. So if we declared, if we use the ng template in HTML, index.html, for example, it will be rendered as a normal HTML element, and the content inside of it will be rendered. So it's only when embedded within a component template that ng template works as a template that holds embedded views. So the ng template tag itself gets rendered as a comment. And we can think of the embedded view as sort of like a fragment of the component view that is not part of a component at this moment, but we can create the view and then add it as not just this component, we could add it to a child component, for example. So in order to create the embedded views dynamically, we need to get hold of the ng template from our code, from our TypeScript code. So TemplateRef is TypeScript code representation of ng template. It is quite a simple API, which basically has the element ref, which points to the ng template itself, and that would be a comment, and a method to create embedded view, which takes the context, the type of the context, and returns an embedded view. So to access ng template, we need to get we can access ng template in few different ways. We can place a template reference variable on the ng template, and then from a component class, we can use ViewChild query and get hold of the template reference instance. Or if, in the case of structural directives, which is placed as an attribute on the ng template, the attribute directive class can get hold of its host using dependency injection. So when we access TemplateRef, we get an instance which is actually of the type TemplateRef underscore, which is a class that implements TemplateRef and has got private properties that actually keep the nodes that are declared within the embedded templates, embedded view. So how does ng template get its data? The embedded view will be able to have property binding, interpolation, and event binding, just the same as component view would. But how does it get its data? The context for ng template is the component template. So it will have access to any of the template reference variables that have been declared on the component template, as well as have access to the component class instance. But ng template also has template input variables which let us access the properties that have been made available by when creating the template, when creating the view. So now that we have a reference to a ng template, we can create an instance of the embedded view using the create embedded view method of the instance, and then passing in the context, and we will get a reference to the embedded view instance. But where will the view be rendered? It won't actually be rendered anywhere at this moment because it is not part of a component yet. In order for a view, an embedded view or a dynamic view to be rendered, it has to be added to a view container. So, like in this picture, the boat is anchored to the island by the tree. A view container anchors the dynamic views to a view component by the anchor element. So, in the structural directives case, the anchor element would be the ng template, which will be the comment when rendered as it will be a comment. So, how do we access the view container? From a component class, well, again, we can place a template reference variable on the ng template, and from a component class, we can use ViewChild query and then pass in the read ViewContainterRef token to get an instance of the ViewContainerRef, or from the directive we can use we can use dependency injection. And this will give an instance of the ViewContainerRef API, which will have properties that the element will be the anchor element. The length initially will be 0. You have the injector available, the element injector available, and it has a private method, a private property called embedded views, which is actually where all the views that are dynamic views that are created get stored. So the methods to create dynamic views are create component, because we can have two sorts of views in Angular. One is in the component and one is ng-template. So there's two ways of creating dynamic views, through dynamic components and through ng-templates. So the create embedded view method, so you're probably thinking, we already created a view using the TemplateRef instance. So why do we have another create embedded view method? Well, in ViewContainerRef, the ViewContainerRef create embedded view method calls the TemplateRef create embedded view method, and then it also calls its insert method, which is what inserts the views description into the embedded views array. And it is this array that the API has got methods to manipulate and query the views. It's this array that it accesses to query and manipulate the view. Just to sum up from the TemplateRef and ViewContainerRef topics, the concept ViewContainer is a concept. The abstract class is ViewContainerRef, and it's implemented by ViewContainerRef _ class. Same with template. It's a concept which is the abstract class is TemplateRef, and it's implemented by TemplateRef _. So now we can have a look at steps to create our own structural directives. Before we look at the steps, though, the most important thing that I want to highlight is that there is so the parts involved are TemplateRef, ViewContainerRef, and the directive class. And there is communication between the ng-template and the directive class. The ng-template will need to pass in the values, the data that the directive class needs. And on the other hand, the directive class will have to communicate the context, the state or methods that the directive exposes back to the ng-template, so it can use it in using template input variables. So even before we start building the structure of directives, we need to plan it. So we have to think about what problem does it solve, and what would be its API, what input properties do we need, and what context objects, how to design the context object, what properties should we expose. So then we can go and create the context object, declare input properties, and get TemplateRef and ViewContainerRef instances, and then implement the logic. So first, context object. So context object is basically an object which has a special property called implicit, and then any other properties that we define on the context object. And the template input variable can just access the context, the properties on the context object. It doesn't have to say context dot or know about what you call the context object in the structural directive. It can just access the properties. So what state do we need to provide the embedded view, and what methods do we want to expose? The $implicit is kind of like what is the most important thing that we state that we're using the structural directive? So, for example, in ng4, it's a list. We iterate over list. So the most important thing is that we want to know what is the current item in the list. So that would become your implicit property. So then we're able to just say the user will have contextual meaning of this item, so they can just say let book of books or movie of movies, etc. And behind the scenes, let book becomes let book equals $implicit. We're able to modify the context object from the directive class. So as we implement the structured directive, we can change the context and update it. It is a good idea to create a type for the context object. As we saw earlier, the TemplateRef has got a generic type for its argument, and so it takes the context object type. We can use either an interface or a class. ng4 uses class, and so it has got use of the constructor and the getters to create the properties. So after we've created the context object, we want to create input properties. What is the data that the structural directive needs to be passed in? We want to make the structural directive quite configurable. So we would add any input properties that allow the structural directive to be configurable. And with the example of a carousel, the main thing, the compulsory thing we need is what is this a carousel of, but then we can also have input properties to say if the autoplay should be on and what the delay should be. One of the important things I want to highlight about input properties is that the input property names are prefixed with directive attribute names, and then when used in the microsyntax, the directive attribute names are left out. So we have a more concise and more concise syntax, which allows us to be quite expressive. So we can say something like at carousel equals let book from books, and then let controls equals controls. Or if we have a structured directive which checks if the user has permission to see a view, you can have has permission, role, else has not permission, where has not permission will be a reference to a template which will show the view that when the user does not have permission. Right, so the next thing, we want to get hold of the ViewContainterRef and the TemplateRef. Because as we saw earlier, in order to actually render a view, we need to create the view and then add it to a view container. So the way to get hold of the ViewContainterRef and the TemplateRef from the directive class is using dependency injection. The kind of default syntax, the way that this is set up, is that the template, the ng template, will have the view that we want to render. But this might not be the case. So it's a good pattern to allow the template to be passed in as an input. So the next thing is to implement the logic. And here I'm going to try and attempt live coding to show a structured directive so we can see it in action. So the structural directive I would try and make is I would call it declare variable or declare var, app declare var in this case, and it's kind of based on the ngIf structural directive, just to highlight how the syntax of ngIf and then passing it like the condition as a variable, how that actually works. So with this structural directive, we can say what the variable is, and then define a template input variable to store that in, and then we are able to use that in our embedded view. So. Okay, so here's where I have my pointers to, so who remembers the steps to create the structural directives? First of all, we've got to create the context object. So I'll use a class, and I'll use the same name as this attribute, and then capitalize it, and then call it context. So I've got an app declare var context, and the trick with creating this directive is that the selector name, the attribute, the directive attribute name will be the same as an input property name, as well as there will be a property on the context object with the same name. So I need to declare app declare var as a property in my context, and I will just type it any at this moment, sorry. Okay, and then, so I've done the type. So now I need to say context, app context equals, I'll create an instance of that. So I have a context. So that's the first bit done. I've got my context object. Then I want to declare input variable, which as I mentioned, will be the same name again as the selector, the directive attribute name. So, and I will use a setter so that if the input property changes, we are okay. And here I want to set the context property the same as the, so what I've done, okay, let me just finish implementing that, then I will talk through it again. So I'll implement on init. Okay, so here is where I want to actually create the structured directive. So I'll, oh, hang on, I have missed a step. Nobody told me that. I have not got hold of the template reference and ViewContainterRef. So I need that TemplateRef. Ref, and then, right? Now all I have to do is create the actual view, and I will use, for that we use the ViewContainterRef API and use the create embedded view method. We pass in the TemplateRef because that's the template that's got the view. and we pass in the context. So, is that everything? So, that should work, and I have got some bit of markup so I don't type everything. And see. So what I've got here, oh, okay. So that's worked. But I'll show you why. So what I've done here is I've declared, I've used my structure directive app declare var equals, and here is where we need to decipher what the microsyntax does. So here, I'm assigning a... so here's an expression. Basically, that means that it's doing something like this. So ng template, and I've got... equals me. So that's what it's doing. And then because because I have got an input property, which is the same as the attribute name, I'm able to use this concise syntax that we have with directives in Angular anyway, where if you have the property name the same as the attribute name, we can apply the directive as an attribute, as well as do data binding to give it a value into the input property. So that's that bit. And then where I have actually defined a property on the context object with the same name as the directive attribute, I'm able to then assign it a value, do something like this. Let person equals I don't need sorry, there. So I'm able to do that. Let's see if I'm lying or not. Hang on, and then I need to use the person. So here it is, if you can see. And it's not styled, so it's tiny. And so one of the things I want to point out at this point is that whatever's in the ng template will be like siblings to the view container anchor of the view container. So if you have if we have individual elements like this, they will all be siblings. So if we want to actually have a containing element, we would wrap it in a div or a section if you want to be semantic, using semantic HTML. But in order to style that view, you do have to wrap it in some kind of wrapper element. So just to show the bit with the change detection, I've got, so, okay, I will show you what I have in my in my data set. So I've got simply a person, which is an object with a name, and I've got an observable of that. And I've got a cat, which has got a name, and then I've got a quick method to change the person. Okay, so if I go back to here, so this bit, can run it. We'll show that so this is the using the async pipe. It's been able to have two sets of async pipes and then store all that in one input variable. Oh, where is my change? Okay, hang on. Just to forgot to put the button. Okay, and then if I change it, changes. And that's it. That's my simple structural directive, which lets you declare a variable on an element, which hopefully helps, to kind of understand how ngIf implements that. And that's it. That's me.